Good evening. When I'm asked to speak about the life of someone as important as Omer Stewart, I always feel intimidated. I thought I knew Omer. I felt very comfortable with Omer always. But I found out from this exercise that I didn't know a lot about Omer. Since this started, I've renewed my understanding of Omer in hope in this evening's presentation to talk about why Omer is important. I'd like to speak about what he did, at least some of the important things he did, and maybe most importantly, what can we learn from his life? In order to learn something of the rich record that Omer left us, I've talked to a number of people over the years. Some are deceased and some are not, but all have contributed to my knowledge of Omer. Among those I've spoken with, Joe Ben Wheat was one of the first. Joe Ben said some very nice things about Omer. Omer was ahead of him at Berkeley, and when Joe Ben showed up, he needed a place, and after Omer and Lenore were married, he said that their home became a home for him. So Joe Ben spent a lot of time with Omer and Lenore at Berkeley. Another person, a compatriot from Berkeley, now deceased also, is Gordon Hughes. Gordon Hughes was another fellow student at Berkeley, and Gordon Hughes managed to convince everyone that he was the heir apparent to Kroeber. He knew as much as Kroeber. That was an incredible endorsement since Kroeber knew everything. Another person I've talked to that's helped me understand Omer, and I suggest you talk also when you have a chance, is Jack Kelso. Omer founded this department and took it through its first growing pains, hiring a number of important people who hired yet other important people. But among the most important that he hired was Jack Kelso, in my opinion. Jack took what Omer had created and ran with it and built a department I think we can all be proud of. I'll talk more about that. I also want to express my appreciation to Steve Stewart, who's sitting to my right, Omer's older son, and to Carl, his younger son. I also want to mention a couple other people that I've talked to from which I've learned a great deal about Omer. I've talked to some of the claims case attorneys in Washington, D.C. for whom he worked and for whom he was so successful in securing the judgments for the tribes against dear Julian Steward, with whom he had a lifelong tension, to say the least. In fact, they confronted each other in the Indian Claims courts, and much to Julian's dismay, Omer put him down every time. Omer won against Julian, okay? But Julian never forgave him. Julian tried to destroy him and blacklist him. And I think these are some things that I've learned in talking to the attorneys in law firms like Wilkinson, Cragen, and Barker, whom I've met and talked with, including Omer. But I also have learned a lot from Omer by talking to the tribal leaders who knew Omer. And I've encountered them along with Native American church leaders over the years. It's sort of like Omer has left a trail. It's still warm. When I get there, I can always find out who he visited and a lot of what they think about him. But I think it's important to say that Omer probably is the only anthropologist, there may be one or two more, at whom American Indians showed up at his funeral in large numbers. He was revered, he was admired, and he was respected in all his interactions with the tribes. And I've confronted many of the tribes where he worked. I've worked with peyote leaders and land claims cases and so on. So I know a little bit about how the tribes view him. And I've learned that as part of getting a fix on this very complex character that's extremely difficult to properly represent. So one of the things that I want to do at the beginning is to apologize for leaving something important out. I'm sure I'm going to leave something important out that's important to one of you, or maybe more than one of you. So I don't think I can do Omer 100% credit, but I'm going to try my best tonight to tell you what I think of Omer, and start with my own association with Omer. As a beginning graduate student up at the University of Oregon, I found that Omer's name was known among my professors. In fact, because of my interest in acculturation and the tribes and tribal religions, a couple of my professors suggested that I go find Omer. Take a trip to Colorado, see if you can find him. Talk to him, listen to him, tell him what you're interested in. Homer Barnett was one of his classmates at Berkeley, and Homer was directing some of my graduate work, along with David Aberle, who published with Omer on peyote. They have a joint publication, Ute and Navajo Peyotism, published by the University of Utah. And David Aberle was actually my dissertation director and helped me understand Omer and why Omer was important in terms of the interests that I had. Anyway, as a grad student, I began to understand something of Omer's importance. I began to read things. If you can imagine reading the cultural element distribution lists, 4,000 items in some of those lists that Omer put together, and another 24 or so Berkeley graduates put together for Kroeber. Kroeber's aim at Berkeley was to create a more scientific ethnology. What he wanted was comparability and detailed information across tribes within large culture areas like the Great Basin. Omer was happy with that. Omer found that workable. He sent Omer out to do some work in the basin with a culture element distribution form, and I guess toward the end of his preparations to go, he asked Kroeber what he should take with him, or how he should prepare himself. And Kroeber said, I think a notebook and a pencil would be a good idea. So Kroeber's advice, I think, reflected something about Omer and Kroeber. I think their relationship was one of father to son. It was a filial quality about their relationship. Another very famous teacher at Berkeley was, of course, several good people, all of whom act as uncles, all whom acted as essentially relatives. I happen to like kinship and talking about relationships among people in anthropology, and I can point to some even in this room in which kinship connects people. Jack Kelso, who knows an awful lot about Omer, speaks in terms of intellectual themes and transformation of the field as different themes emerge. However, backing up a little bit, I had the good fortune in the spring of last year in fact, it's the spring of this year, in April, to talk with Steve Stewart. Steve came to the High Plains Applied meetings in Denver, and he said he was going to give a paper about his dad. And I listened to that paper, and I've thought about that paper since that time, and I've thought about that paper that Steve gave in light of everything else that I've learned about Omer. And I want to recite the key values that Steve received from Omer, and I presume Carl and Kate and Ann likewise. Science is important. Value 1. All people are equal. Value 2. Anthropologists need to put their knowledge to work. Value 3. Right wrongs where you can. Value 4. Try new things. Value 5. Share your knowledge. Learn and respect other cultures. And finally, work for the good of others. Although these seem like values that many parents might want to teach to their children, the important point for me is that these values carried through Omer's life, I think, into his work with the tribes, with the citizens of the University of Colorado and the surrounding community. I think he carried these values and expressed them in numerous ways, and I want to talk a little bit about those tonight. I think that it's important to imagine young Omer appearing from Utah, showing up at Berkeley, and beginning a very long career that really begins at Berkeley. Some would say it begins at Utah, where he wanted to be a lawyer to start with, till he heard a lecture from his nemesis, Julian Steward. Nevertheless, I would think that his life as an anthropologist really begins under Kroeber. Who doesn't know who Kroeber is? Who cares to know who Kroeber is? Some of you. Kroeber is the dean of anthropology, as far as I'm concerned, in the U.S. Boaz is sometimes cited as a founder, but Boaz, while important, did not have near the influence that Kroeber did, and I think that Omer reflected Kroeber throughout his life. But I'd like to show you how you like a timeline of Omer's life, his professional life. We've prepared a timeline. It's very difficult probably to see in its entirety, but the timeline begins, and I don't know if anyone will ever do that for anyone else's life. It's a very difficult task. But you can see that it begins really quite early. Of course, he was born in 1908, died in 1991, here in Boulder. For us, I took an arbitrary date, 1928, as where we would begin the line of his career, leading up to 1987, with the publication of his massive, always influential peyote religion book. Wherever I go in the tribes want the book. So I would say I've bought more and distributed more of those books than any book salesman in this country. But Omer lived a long and productive life, and I want this timeline to be shown in whatever record is kept of this meeting, because it's our best effort to construct the important mileposts along the way that he achieved, everything from leaving Utah and going to Berkeley to his final lifelong work that was published at the University of Oklahoma in 1987. Not to say, however, that peyote is the only important thing. I would like to go to the maturation of Omer under Kroeber, if we can talk a little bit about that. There are a series of items in Kroeber that show up, I think, in Omer's work. There's a kind of encyclopedism, a wide-ranging control of highly diverse sets of data, highly diverse interests, nevertheless all seeming to fit together. Omer's many interests, from peyote to culture element distribution lists, to fire ecology, to social activism in regard to the racism in Boulder and elsewhere, to the Indian Claims Commission work. There's a unity here that I think is a vision he shares with Kroeber, and I think Kroeber tried to share that vision with yet others. Kroeber succeeded with Omer in a way I think he did not succeed with many others. There were a number of other famous people that Kroeber did succeed with, but not like Omer. I think Omer was as close to the Kroeber ideal anthropologist as anyone might ever think possible. I think his first field work was very formative. And these are the culture element distribution lists in which he was sent by Kroeber with pencil and notebook, plus some forms, to determine the cultural content of Great Basin groups. I think the learning of this quantitative assessment, this detailed assessment, this formal method of describing, led to and is influencing, if you look at the development of peyotism, his research on peyote. I think that it also influenced his work that appeared and he developed along the way on fire ecology. The idea of controlling a large geographic area and controlling a particular piece of information and understanding that information as it shifted from one context to another within a very large region, like the United States, for example, with the fire ecology book. And likewise with peyote, which extends from northern Mexico up into Canada. I had the good fortune of attending a few meetings with Omer, and Duck Valley was where our paths tended to cross, but he also managed to reach clear out into the Northwest. There was one area left that he hadn't really thoroughly investigated for the peyote book. But really his peyote book is a continent-wide coverage. And it's a several centuries coverage. The fire ecology book is the same. The culture element distribution lists are the same. And I trace this influence to Kroeber, to Sauer. He took courses from the famous geographer Carl Sauer. I trace that to Lowy, who was very interested in the Great Basin and got him going, Robert Lowy. And all these relationships went into Omer. But I think Omer's background, which we haven't talked much about in Utah, which most people want to talk about, his Mormonism, or at least his membership in the Mormon Church, that he abandoned early in his life after an unsuccessful mission, I think, when he went to France. Gordon Hughes, his good friend who used to teach here, whom he hired from Berkeley, thought that the experience in Europe as a Mormon missionary had done a lot to shape Omer's vision of the world also, to give him a continent-wide, an intercontinental-wide view of the world. I think that most people would think that Omer's major administrative achievement is building the early Department of Anthropology here at the university. And this is his field work. This is right after peyote ceremony, by the way. And he's coming out of this, and he suffered. Omer wasn't above suffering with the people that had to sit all night with only one break at midnight, as they do in the peyote ceremony. He suffered, like all who go through that suffer. It's not just about ingesting peyote, however sacred that is. It is about suffering, and suffering for some purpose or for some person. And you'll see that in the faces of some of these people who are just coming out of the ceremony, in particular this gentleman. The pain is incredible of sitting bow-legged 6 hours at a time, getting a break at midnight, then going on through until the sun rises. Omer did that. Omer did that a lot. And it was his idea of field work that I think Kroeber and Lowy had instilled in him. You need to know the people. You need to be there. You can't, like Paul Radin or Morris Opler or some of his other adversaries, say that really the peyote church is anything until you've been there. And Omer was there. But he found that the work of Oplers, the two brothers, and people like Radin, who wrote voluminously about peyote, had it all mixed up. And as with Julian, Omer managed to antagonize them as well, because he found them to be wrong, incorrect, and he demonstrated it by a simple recording of fact that he observed because he believed in participant observation, and that he had been taught that very successfully at Berkeley by Kroeber, Lowy, and others. I think that in building this department, Omer tried to instill some of these values in the people whom he hired, like Bob Lister, Gordon Hughes, Dadi Kashubi, and others as time unfolded, but particularly, as I've said earlier, Jack Kelso. So Omer had adopted at Berkeley not only a method of research, he also adopted a four-field idea of archaeology, biology, cultural, and linguistics, and felt that the four were absolutely essential to a complete department. So early on, he committed the department to a four-fold division. Not only that, however, as he built this department, he took yet other inspiration he had, perhaps from his Mormon background, I don't know. But social justice began to emerge as a major concern. And his work in applied, that reflects the value of making your work beneficial to others, came to the fore very early on. His applied anthropology, of course, was something that interested me a great deal, because I share his view that anthropology should be helpful, useful, and that we should try to right wrongs. And Omer found that applied, especially after his discharge from the military, he came back and he managed to help found the Society for Applied Anthropology, and for years was one of its leading members. He received the Malinowski Award toward the end of his life from the same Society for Applied Anthropology. So not only did the department have a four-fold division here, and he began building that and expanding that, it also had a real concern with application. While building this department, and in building this department, many administrators had to face Omer, and I wanted you to see this. I want you to dwell on it for just a minute. And think of yourself as a dean of arts and sciences confronting this guy. Just try to absorb what you think Omer's like looking at this. I think it really does reflect what Jack Kelso said about him. He was blunt, abrupt, and effective in his dealings, in building the department, and confronting the university and securing the resources necessary for its development. So I always feel that this is one side of Omer you don't mess with. I've seen him put down administrators at the University of Colorado, like Lawson Crowe, who was trying to take away the anthropology publications. And he blasted Lawson Crowe, who was vice chancellor at the time, in such a manner that Lawson started crying. You ever see an administrator cry? I have. I saw Lawson Crowe cry. I was with Omer that day. Omer had a way of slamming you that I think a few people in this room probably know. Other things he did to build the department was to build the library. The Human Relations Area File, for example, he got it here. Slotkin was one of the early students of peyotism at Chicago, and Slotkin's papers came here. Why? Because of Omer again. Omer was able to bring a number of libraries here to this library in a manner that enhanced the research strength of the anthropology and related departments. I think that Omer always felt that the department was never big enough, always needed expansion, improvement, growth, development. Omer was a guy who believed in not only quality research, but he also had this deep commitment to growth and development and cultivation, if you like. I sometimes think that, again, may reflect some of his rural background, but it's like growth. Let's make it grow. Let's plant some seeds here. Let's let this thing come alive and grow. And I think he had that attitude about the anthropology department. There are a number of things that I think we could talk about in the early days of the department. There's Joe Ben Huid and Omer Stewart with some of their first students. If you remember, Joe Ben came and went to the museum, and Omer went to the department. And Joe Ben was always very careful to compliment Omer, not only because he had stayed in Omer's home in Berkeley with Lenore and Omer, but because when he got here, anthropology was an essential part of the museum as far as Omer was concerned. And he made that connection very early. It may be that Steve's going to talk about that, but it's clear that Omer thought that the two belonged together. He cross-listed courses, for example, with the museum, and did much to build the museum. I think that, again, in his adversarial advocating role in approaching the administration, he succeeded where many others failed. They would make a promise and he would never let them forget it. They made it under pressure and he would never let them forget it. Most of us know great men by one or two things that they've done. I think we don't fully appreciate all the things that many great men do, or women. We'll pick one thing, and one of the big things that everyone remembers Omer for is what? Peyote. Peyote is the one thing that virtually everyone knows about Omer. And I think that's fine. And I think that it is, in fact, a great testament to Omer, to his passion, to Native Americans, and especially to his methodology and his history. He put a rigor to the study of peyote that was never present before. I've mentioned that he participated, okay? But he then made a point of being encyclopedic in his coverage. He covered North America, which I've mentioned. And I want to talk just a little bit about what Vine Deloria had to say about Omer. Some of you know who Vine Deloria was. You know who Vine was? Most people know who Vine was? Okay. Vine, after reading it, having read many anthropological treatises, decided that this was the way all anthropologists should write. None had equaled what Omer had done, that all anthropologists should read Peyote Religion, that it is the way anthropology should do it. And it's to talk to the people. It's to record what the individual has to say about what you're investigating. And Vine saw this in Omer, and they were good friends. Even though Vine is one of those vaunted enemies of anthropology, which he never was really. He was actually friendly, but he was a very competitive kind of guy and felt that critical arguments were constructive. And he liked to have them with anthropologists, including myself. But I was always a loser in those contests. But Omer and he seemed to really get on. Omer knew everybody Vine knew, and Vine knew almost all anthropologists that Omer knew. So they had a great deal in common. And it came out, I thought, beautifully in the manner in which Vine complimented Omer on his book, The Peyote Religion. This is Omer as a young man, about what he must have looked like when he was building the department at Boulder. I think this is about the right age, about the right image for that period of time. And I think that you have to agree he's a pretty handsome guy. And I'm told that a lot of women thought so. I mean, in a nice way, of course. But he was widely admired for his looks, for his gift of gab, for his work, and all that comes together, I think, in this picture. He's in Washington, D.C. This is one of his first entries into the Indian Claims Commission business. The Indian Claims Commission in 1946 was passed by Congress to make sure that tribes that had not been given proper compensation for the lands that had been taken from them would receive adequate compensation. So the law firm from Utah, actually, Wilkinson, Craigen, and Barker, retained Omer. And I think they retained him on Kroeber's recommendation, but I'm not sure of that. In any case, Omer became very close with Wilkinson, Craigen, and Barker and handled literally dozens of cases. These cases produced many millions of dollars for the tribes and allowed them once again to hold their heads up and to take pride in their sovereignty such that they could actually file a claim with the U.S. government and win as governments, as domestic dependent governments certainly, but as governments nevertheless. And I think that it's during this time that some of the fruit of the Indian Reorganization Act that began under FDR was beginning to take hold. And the Indian Claims Commission Act, I think, strengthened a lot of tribes. They had some money to work with for a change. And Omer was a very big hand in that. And I think this is during that period in D.C. when the Indian Claims Commission work was really getting underway. Another thing that I think Omer needs to be recognized for is his work with fire ecology. Fire ecology is the practice by whomever of altering the ecology of a region by fire. Seems obvious enough. The problem is that anthropologists and much of the public, until Omer in the early 50s, brought it to their attention that the whole of the continent had been managed by fire by Native Americans or American Indian people. They did it for specific reasons of increasing the return from that environment, increasing the productivity of the environment, eliminating unwanted products of various types, and in the process, essentially turning the environment into a large garden. Nevertheless, Europeans, when they came to the New World, what did they find? They found a wilderness, of course, devoid of human impact, when indeed the whole area is being managed. Not only agriculture in the southeast and southwest, but fire throughout the whole continent, systematically applied to produce more of the necessities of life. I'm working with the Yakima right now, and I was reminded the other day that they are currently practicing fire ecology to increase the return on their huckleberry patches. The canopy needs to be opened above huckleberries so that the huckleberries will form and will take the shape and taste that they require. Fire is being used at Yakima to enhance huckleberries at this time. We didn't start the fire in 4 Mile Canyon, but I am convinced that it's going to really improve things up there for several reasons. I happen to live up there, and we think that the fire is going to be a great benefit. We've had a huge overgrowth of timber up there from the days of the miners. Took all the timber and then everything came back in a hurry, and none of it was very healthy, but a great deal of it disappeared. And we're going to see some improvement, I think. So fire ecology, we think, is a major contribution area in which Omer was able to bring to the attention of ecologists in biology the importance of this influence in the transformation and management of the American ecosystem. Since that time, there's been some sharp increase in the awareness of people, not only in the United States, ecologists and biologists and others, but also in countries like Australia and Canada. There's been a good deal more study of the tribal use of fire to manage the environment. One of the things, this is in Australia, by the way, fire ecology is now a recognized area within ecology, and it's being employed systematically under controlled conditions. I think that when we look at Omer's contribution in this area, it went for 50 years without recognition. He started working on his book in about 52 or 3 or 4. It came out 50 years later. But when it did, it made clear for all to see that there was no wilderness. There was no unattended lands and resources here. I think that anthropologists are among those guilty of ignoring this. I think archaeologists need to do more with fire ecology and the understanding of how it might have influenced the prehistoric situation in the New World. But I think that I would like to summarize with a few contributions that I think we can trace to our good friend Omer. First of all, I think he's more systematic and more controlled in his methodology than virtually any other anthropologist I've ever known. If Omer said it was this way, you can rest assured it was this way. Omer knew what he talked about. Omer saw theory as dogma. Some people think that that came from his rejection of Mormon dogma, but it also came with the rejection of Julian Steward's dogma about cultural evolution and the effort to combine the environment with the technology to produce an ecology that explained human cultural evolution. Omer said that was nonsense. Ecology is to be studied in terms not only of what the environment has for the people, but what the people do to the environment. You cannot go one way or the other. He thinks that ecology requires a coming together of both what people take from it, what it can give, but also what people do to the environment. And this is the basis of the fire ecology that was so important to him, that he actually started working on very early in his career. So, other things that we could say about Omer, beyond the fact that he built a really fine department, I think his spirit lives with us in anthropology at this time. I think that Omer was able to build a department that now fits the image that he acquired from Kroeber, which was a world science of mankind, or of humankind. I think we would probably use humankind right now. But I think that the fact that we have activities in South Africa, Central Africa, North Africa, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, Tibet, Vietnam. We have in Middle America, we have in Mexico, we have in Brazil, and of course we have in Oceania, all of Oceania. We have representation in the skills of our faculty and the focus of our faculty in these areas. I think, of course, North America continues to be a focus. It is especially for archaeologists, but for ethnographers like myself as well. So I think that what Omer began as a very limited enterprise has done what Omer liked. It has grown and expanded and is thriving. This department enrolls more undergraduates than virtually any other department in the region. We have a very distinguished faculty. We have a very distinguished group of graduates who've gone on to important contributions in yet other areas of the world. So there are many things I could add and say, but I would like to take a few moments and see if there are some questions that we might entertain at this point, providing I am able to deal with them. If I'm not, there will be someone in the room who can.
I was just wondering if so Opler never was at any of those ceremonies himself.
No.
It was always informants coming and telling
According
him.
to Omer, no. Neither was Paul Radin. And the point being that the two Oplers and Radin said that the peyote complex moved and was modified and reshaped by the culture in which it was found. He said no. He had detailed records of exactly how the ceremony was performed in each tribal group, and it didn't change. That was his main argument against the Oplers and against Radin, I think.
I don't have any particularly good question, but I want to just make an observation to add what you're saying.
Fine.
I'm a physician, but my first course in anthropology was in 1957 with Omer Stewart. And I was in my second year of the university, and I just would say that it was a tremendously important moment for me in my life, because he made me think, maybe not for the first time, but for the first time really become engaged with certain important subjects, and challenge my beliefs and my thoughts. And I think that I owe a great deal to Omer, as I've told him, for any intellectual progress that I've made since then. And I revere him. I don't make a practice of revering people, but in his case I'll make an exception.
Okay.
But he was a fantastic person. He was a little cranky sometimes, but as I was reinforced when he and I rode together down to Society for Anthropology, a lot of entomology meetings in Santa Fe.
Right.
And he drove part of the way, but we had a great time. But anyway, I think of him very fondly, both in terms of personal affection and in terms of my own personal intellectual growth.
Wonderful.
And thank you also for what you're doing.
Thank you. Are there other questions or comments? I have one last thing I'd like to bring out. When you think of a great man like Omer and all he did, you wonder, what did it all amount to? So, he published all these papers, he published the books, he died and he went away. A few of us remember him. But what else is there about Omer that we should talk about? And I'd like to point to recent investigation of the Citation Index. And I'd like to point out ways in which Omer continues to be alive and help us. How he in his life has managed to persist in his influence. You can see the increasing use of his various books. They include the Fire Ecology book, they include the life history, of course, but they include the peyote book. They include the book he did with Martha Knack on Pyramid Lake. But I think that Omer's life lives. His influence is evident as it has increased from the early 60s to now, where it's, in a sense, overwhelming in the citation record that is evidence of the influence of his ideas increasing through time. I think the fact that the laws now governing and protecting American Indian uses of peyote are part of his enduring heritage. He is a main figure in providing testimony in Congress to secure the protection of American Indians who choose to be members of the peyote church and to transport and ingest peyote. I think that his influence is evident right today as a number of NARF attorneys, Native American rights attorneys who helped him a lot and whom he helped a lot in the defense of peyotism. Those attorneys are now in Mexico, developing a connection between the Native American Church of the United States and the Native American Church of Mexico. His influence is still evident all around us. Anyone that does anything in the Great Basin has to confront Omer, dead or alive. I think the fact that Omer has left downstairs a massive inventory of his papers reflects the fact that he was such a good documentarian. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of citations appear in the fire ecology book. Likewise in the peyote book. He was just absolutely indefatigable in the manner in which he would search out documentary evidence to sustain the evidence that he had acquired from direct participation in the cultures of the basin, in the areas he studied with fire ecology and peyote and so on. So I'd like to say that Omer Stewart's alive, or rather Omer Stewart's influence is alive and well, and that he continues, as does this department continue, in many ways reflecting his influence, which I think it always will. But I think in the field at large, several fields at large, Omer is still very much alive as he is downstairs in the archives. If you want to see what Omer was like, go take a look at the archives. Go try to find something in the archives. You'll find it there. Omer did it. Whatever it is mine. One of the things that came up just now is the singing of peyote song, and Steve has suggested that he might lead us in a peyote song that Omer frequently, I think, repeated and taught him well. If you'd like to stand, Steve is going to lead us in a peyote song. Please stand.
The roadman takes his staff, and the drummer kneels by him and drums in unison. And this is the opening hymn. There are 4 fixed hymns. It goes like this. Now you just follow my rhythm. Sing 4 times. 4 is the sacred number, but I have to strain too hard, so I don't sing 4 unless I've had a little purity. The whole evening is spent singing these hymns. The roadman sings 4, and then he passes it on to the cedar man, and he drums for the cedar man. Then I should have held the fan. The fan and the rattle are put together and passed on, and each person sitting on the front of the row can sing or not. Now I didn't know any hymns, and so what should I do? Well, I drummed twice and then passed on. Then after midnight, I ate a little more peyote, and I felt a little more religious. And they said to sing any song that you wanted. So I was thinking, now what hymn do I know that fits that rhythm? And none that the only one that I could really think of was Jesus wants me for a sunbeam, and that wasn't the same rhythm. And I couldn't do well. I waited and ate a little more peyote, and then I decided that I could sing one. So this is my first peyote song. Western, several of the men smiled broadly. You don't laugh in church, but they'd been in World War I and knew that was a Canadian folk song. But they said, that's all right, just anything you sing is right. The ritual goes on, just different people, you take turns singing until midnight.